You've maybe heard it said that you should avoid using Christianese language, that is insider Christian religious words, because it isolates people who are outside of the group if you're trying to attract people to your church. But is there ever a time where Christianese is okay? In this Word Made Digital tutorial, we're going to talk about it. Hello my friends, welcome to Word Made Digital Tutorials. I'm Joanna LaFleur. This tutorial we're talking about when or if it's ever okay to use Christianese. And I love the heart behind the question is because we're trying to think of newcomers. We're trying to think of people who don't come from a church background, which is increasingly more and more people. We don't want to isolate them. And I think it comes out of the seeker-friendly movement. Of sort of the last 20 and 30 years, there was this leaning in to think about how do we make our church communities friendly and sensitive to the fact that there would be people coming, and we would even be inviting people who aren't Christian, who don't know how church works. And so I love that we want to think about that. So the first thing I want to do is say, yes, there are times where Christianese, that is insider Christian language, is okay. And let's break down now what we're going to do about that and when that's okay. But a huge shout out to Compassion Canada who are making this video possible. They're doing amazing and transformational work around the world. They partner with local churches, and I'm going to tell you the story of one of the young people who's graduated out of that program and an amazing opportunity to get involved. So just stay tuned for that in a second. Let's get into it. Okay, so is Christianese ever good to use or ever acceptable to use? Let's think about some of those words first of all. Words like the sanctuary or the altar, or I think of songs that talk about washed in the blood of the Lamb, or maybe you're just talking about let's all fellowship together, or pass the peace, or there's the Eucharist. There's all these words that your church will have, every denomination has, that feel really insider. And if you're not from there, if you're not from a religious background, you're from another religion, from another country, another culture, another language, or just a non-church person, you may not know what those words mean. But the first thing to remember is that every group has insider language. If you've ever started a new job, you know that there's insider language. There's all these acronyms you need to learn when you're starting a new job. There's words that you have to build into your vocabulary when you become part of a group. That's normal. So I think at some level, people know that that will happen, and they're not totally shocked about that when they come into a new group. But what we're trying to do is, as quickly as possible, bridge people in, welcome people in, so that they don't feel awkward, confused, maybe they feel dumb, because they don't know what's going on. So that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid. So first thing is, it's normal to have insider language, but the most important thing is we want to translate and bridge it for people. So here's what you should do next. Get a list and an inventory going of your language. How do you talk about yourself? This is in some ways related to brand. We did a whole video about branding for your church where you can learn more about that. But it's this idea of how we speak about ourselves and how other people speak about us. What is the language that we use? So maybe you should do an inventory of the language that's used on your staff, the kinds of words you use to describe things, the things that are talked about in sermons, the things that are on signs or in bulletins or on website or in social media. You know, if you're telling everyone, even for example, to come to the altar at the end of the service, people may not know what altar is, they may not know what service is. Maybe you've experienced this, that someone comes up at the end of a Sunday together and they say to the pastor, the preacher, the minister, oh, that was a great lecture, or that was a great speech that you gave. They don't even have the word for sermon in their vocabulary. It's not because they're a dumb person, it's because they aren't part of your culture. And so over time, they might integrate into that language and culture if they stick around. But we want to make sure that we're aware of doing an inventory of all those kinds of words that we have in our community. And further to that, you might actually want to engage some people who are outside of your church community to help you identify those. Okay, so once you have your list, you have an inventory of all the things that might be those words, whether you've pulled them yourself or you've gotten some outside insight into what some of those words may be. Now you need to decide what to do with those words. Maybe you want to keep some of them, maybe you want to change some of them in your vocabulary as a community. You know, there's some words that are totally great and the right word to use, and other ones are an unnecessary obstacle. And So once we've identified them, we might want to change them. So here's an example. For example, you might have something that you call the altar, and by tradition, that might not even be an altar anymore. It's just a space in the front of the room. So maybe you just want to say to people, come to the front instead of come to the altar. You may not even have an altar, but your traditions keep using the word long past the time that that physical object has been removed. That's an example. There's lots of words like that. Like if you want to use the word Eucharist for the bread and the cup that you take together. Some people call it communion, the Lord's Supper. There's lots of other ways to describe it. But you may say, no, that's absolutely the word we want to use, but is there a way that we can help people bridge to it? And so that is going to be my next key point for you. Now that you've identified religious words that you want to keep, that is the Christianese lingo that actually is valuable and integral to your community, then the most important thing is just to translate it for people. It's totally fine if you want to use the word Eucharist because that is a valuable and historic word for your community, but you just want to explain it to people. You say this is the bread and the juice, or the bread and the wine that we now take together in remembrance, and you just want to explain it to people. It's totally fine to have insider talk even about, okay, we'll see you in the fellowship hall. Maybe they don't know what fellowship means. That sounds a little creepy, so maybe you want to rename that room, but into something like community gathering room, or I don't know, general purpose room, or whatever you want to call it. But if you want to keep with the word fellowship hall, the most important thing next is actually just to explain where it even is in the building. I think once they get there, they're probably going to be able to see what the room is like, what it's used for. There are some things that are unnecessary obstacles where we're so inside of it, we don't realize we're even using Christianese. And that's where this exercise of doing an inventory and getting some feedback helps us identify where those words are, how we can change them, and how we want to use them. In some of the churches that I work with, we recommend using a hot or not list. And what we mean by that is, here's the word we want to use, and here's the word we would prefer you don't use. And so we even have some fun sometimes with teams where if someone uses the not word, we can have a buzzer or like a funny thing we say just to remind them that there's a preferred word that we use. I've seen that, for example, in some churches that they call it a sanctuary. They have called it a sanctuary, but honestly, it's actually a gym or it's an auditorium. It's not really a traditional sanctuary. So they've changed the name because for a lot of people, the word sanctuary is Christianese. It sounds like a bird sanctuary, a butterfly sanctuary. It doesn't sound like something that they understand. It can be an obstacle to them and a bit of a confusing or even just intimidating word, where if you can call it what the room is, if it's an auditorium or if it's a gymnasium or if it's a movie theater that you meet in, wherever it is, it can immediately just help bridge that for people. Translation is the most important thing about using Christianese. If you use Christian language, just make sure you translate it. So that brings me to my last point, which is don't talk down to people. People are smart. People can catch up quick, but the problem is when they first come in, we don't want them to feel unnecessarily disoriented, discombobulated, intimidated, weirdly thinking this might be a cult or something they don't really know. It sounds just like something out of a movie maybe. We just want to help translate it as soon as possible, not because people can't figure it out, but because we're trying to create a welcoming environment. The whole point of this is to think of others before we think of ourselves. What are the needs of others that we can serve? How can we translate our culture, our language, our traditions for someone so that it becomes a welcoming place where people can meet the living God. People can meet Jesus, who knows them and loves them so deeply that they might have an opportunity to come into our community and have everlasting life, as Jesus calls it. And so we want to make sure that we take away unnecessary obstacles, respect people enough to translate for them, and respect them enough to know that they're smart, they're going to figure it out quickly if we would just bring them along with us in a hospitable kind of way. I hope some of these tips have been helpful to you to think through your process of when, where, and how you use Christianese language in your church community. We're talking about churches transforming the lives of people, which is why this conversation matters so much. Compassion Canada is all about that, and they're the sponsors of this video. It's amazing to see the stories of transformational life change as the local church partner with us as people who are involved with compassion get to see transformation. I think of this girl, Ria from the Philippines. She grew out of the program that she's now an alumni, and she talked about the idea of someone who sees you and knows you, that changes you. That she was seen and known, it changed her, it transformed her life, and now she's a young adult, she's aged out of the program, and she's now sponsoring a kid back in the same community where she grew up. Transformation generationally, one impacting the next. It's an amazing opportunity. Go to compassion.ca to learn more. And these tutorials are coming out every single week. If this is helpful to you, we've got a whole archive now of tutorials here on the YouTube channel you can check out. Would love for you to stick around for not just this one, but the next one. So you got to subscribe so you don't miss one. We'll see you on the next tutorial.